Welcome to a special episode of Building Brand Gravity. It's our first Ask Me Anything. And I'm going to be answering some questions that we received from listeners and also that were curated by our team in response to episodes that I've hosted across the second season of our podcast. And I'm very excited to be joined by our producer, John LeMay. Hey, John, who's going to help me address these questions. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you? Happy to be
I'm
here.
I'm very good. I'm very good. So it's our mailbag. Let's get to it.
Yeah, awesome. So we have a handful of questions that have been submitted. Some of them have to do with particular episodes from this past season or particular guests, some conversations that you've had, and then some have to do with kind of more like big picture, recurring questions that have come up or topics that have come up or things about you and your career. So if you're ready to get started, we can do that.
Let's do it. Go ahead. Fire it off. First question.
All right. So in July, you had a conversation with Peter Gudritz, who is the Global Director of Business and Marketing Communications at Dow. And that conversation involved the necessity of multi stakeholder engagement and solving complex issues in areas like energy, climate, or waste reduction. And we received this question. How are you seeing the impact of multi stakeholder engagement in leadership across industries?
Yeah, that's a great that issue of multi-stakeholder engagement. Um, that's a lot of words, like a lot of multi-syllable words, but to me, I think it just respects the fact that our landscape is so much more interconnected now. You think about all the stakeholders of a brand or an issue or a company. Back in the day, not that many years ago, things were a bit more siloed and disconnected. And the other thing I would say is that internal communications, like which is your own employees, your own people, your own organization, was a little bit divorced at times from external communications. And I've very much felt over the years in this field, because it's been over 30 years now, that internal communications was often not seen as important as external. And now, to me, thinking about engagement from a multi-stakeholder way, the world is small, it's very interconnected, news travels fast. And I think a lot of people have realized first and foremost that your internal audience is your employee. It's like I talk about a drop falling in a pond and the rings radiating outward. The first ring after that drop in the pond falls are your own people, and it radiates outward from there. So what's internal is often external too. So to me, it's more connections, less silos, shared responsibility of looking across that whole stakeholder landscape, no matter where people are, and also recognizing that internal audiences are as critical, if not more critical, than those external stakeholders.
So a follow-up to that, when it comes to multi-stakeholder engagement, what are some common pitfalls to avoid, particularly when addressing big areas or big issues like climate change or waste reduction?
Yeah, and I know those are big issues that Peter and his team at Dow are looking at all the time, climate change being a very multifaceted one. The pitfalls for me in this world of stakeholder engagement is assuming but not knowing your audiences. Audiences are not monoliths. We see that demonstrated for us every day. It's complex how people react, what they think. They're more than whatever name they're given on a spreadsheet. They can't be really reduced in that way. So I also think another sidebar to that is in this world of information overflow, especially in social media or all these channels of communications, it can be easy to receive certain communications that feel very intense or very big, but they're actually quite small or narrow. So you're hearing something that sounds like, a fire, but it's maybe a candle, but you need to dig into it to know. So really respecting the idea that you need to dig deep with your audiences, you need to do real research, you need to get out there in the field and meet and know people and not assume. Because with something as multi-layered and multifaceted as, say, climate change or waste reduction or any of the really huge issues that we're facing as a global community, there's going to be so many perspectives. It's really like a prism, and you need to keep turning that so you can see all the faces of it.
And then last follow-up question on this. There is pressure for organizations and leaders to speak to so many things in the public sphere today, but not all are relevant or appropriate. How do organizations make these kinds of judgments?
Yeah, that's a great follow-up, and that came through in the conversation with Peter, but in other places too, I feel. Marta, I know, and we might talk about her in a moment, Marta Ronquillo Newhart. I know we talked about that as well. That it's such an important truth, although it sounds like very surface, this idea of go back to your values as a company. And if you don't really understand what they are and how they manifest in terms of external communications, you got to get clear on that. There's many organizations, of course, they have values and they're stated, but it's a different thing to have a list of values and then understand how when there are difficult, sometimes contentious issues out in the marketplace that affect various of your stakeholders in different ways, often opposing ways, it's very different to understand how those values translate into when you do or do not speak. So each company, and we happen to be an agency, so we advise clients on this, but we have to look at it ourselves too. Every organization has to really reflect on that and say, how am I consistent and what do we want to speak to? How are our values tied to a given issue and how it impacts our stakeholders? And when should we be really confident in speaking out and using our voice? And then when should we, maybe this is not our story and maybe it's time for us to be quiet, but you need a consistent set of questions, an assessment tool, a rubric of some kind so you can be consistent. And you need to get folks in leadership talking about this. So there's agreement before stuff is out there and there's a pressure to speak. And that, because that's when people get in trouble, when they feel this pressure to say something and they put it out there, but it's not really rooted in what they do as an organization or who they are.
Great. And then obviously with this particular question or any of the questions we're gonna talk about, people should feel free to go back and listen to Peter's episode if you want to hear more about this and kind of hear the where the question came from. So shifting gears, our next question. So you had a conversation with Marta Ronquillo Newhart, and that covered how chief communications roles are evolving to be ever more integral and matrixed leadership positions. And that involves responsibilities across many facets of organizations, including driving revenue and aligning with corporate growth strategies, in addition to more traditional responsibilities. Question is, how have you as a communications professional seen your own evolution into a business leader and the impact you've seen of comms over these additional concerns like revenue?
Yeah, it's funny how I'm going back to what I said in an earlier question about multi-stakeholder environment, which is the idea of connection versus being disconnected and siloed. And when I entered the field in the early 90s, there was a sense of communications, not for all companies. I knew some companies that really put it at the C-suite level at the table, with executives, but there was a time that communications was more almost like a service function. Like, oh, well, these are the people that put out the press release or tell them afterwards what it is we want to say and they go say it. That is very disconnected from the core of the business. And I think for me, what I've seen over the course of my career, and I've certainly felt it as a business leader, is the deeper and deeper and deeper connection with what is really driving the business. And that includes revenue, sales, and the connection with marketing and comms and that whole piece. Now, for me, I'm an agency leader, so I'm both running a business but also serving clients. So I've been able to understand that connection to the heart of the business objectives, the outcomes, how those businesses are performing, how integrated marketing and communications tactics tie into that. I've seen it for many, many industries, many, many companies, but I've also had to look at it for my own companies, that I'm a partner in. But it's a good evolution, and I feel like communications leaders are more at the center of that discussion than they have been in the past, which is great.
Hmm. Why do you think there is still this disconnect at times in seeing communications as being a part of the revenue generating activities of an organization? And would you say that some of this is self-inflicted or does it come from somewhere else?
Yeah, that's a good question. Um, one of the things Marta talked about in the episode, and it was a really excellent episode for those who are interested in leading in these areas. She came out of, before she really focused in communications, she was at Boeing in a sales role, selling jet airplanes in China. So she really knew the business from the inside out from the start of her career. But, she talked a lot about, and this resonated for me, how are we spending our time, and do we understand how the time we are spending is generating equity, building equity in the organization. She talked about the example of mergers and acquisitions, the role of communications to build a reputation and equity in the brand of that organization has a real monetary value in a merger or acquisition situation in terms of increasing the value of that entity or increasing the power and stature in order to acquire. So that's just one example of where it can be tough for people to say, well, what is brand worth? There's been innumerable efforts to put a calculation against, brand equity, et cetera, reputation. Some of these things feel loose and hard to define, and they will be. They're more qualitative. They're not the same as a sales made that's captured on a spreadsheet. But I do love Marta's idea about we have to be very clear about activities that build equity and talk about how that equity is being built, because that equity translates into capital in different ways. And that can also help communications leaders and even agencies and others understand, wow, we're doing all these activities, but some of them feel more central to the business outcomes of the organization than others, and more important to the reputation of the organization and the equity of the organization. This is building brand gravity, the gravity of that brand, than others. And that's a good litmus test to say we should be doing more of this and less of that, if you know what I mean.
So in our second episode of this past season, Anne, you sat down with Natalie Nixon, who is the creativity strategist and CEO of Figure Eight Thinking. And you discussed, as the episode is titled, the idea that, yes, we are all creative. You touched specifically on being a translator of perspectives to foster collaboration. So could you share advice on how to effectively navigate and merge different creative lenses within a team?
That's a big question. First of all, I love the episode with Natalie. Natalie Nixon is such a force, and she's out there, writing and speaking and sharing so many different perspectives on unlocking creativity and innovation and understanding ourselves differently in those ways. So I think it's a really fun episode. I know it was one that a lot of people enjoyed. So check it out, as you said. When we talked about being a translator, it was something I brought up with Natalie, which is that I've had the joy of working in a really integrated way across my career. So when I was at a smaller agency years ago, I started at a huge agency, one of the largest in the world at the time, that was naturally integrated creative, and all the pieces digital came online, advertising, communications. And then at a smaller firm, we also had a creative shop from the beginning because our founders, were very invested in that. So what I got to do is work very closely my whole career with those in the, very specifically in the creative field, graphic designers and creative directors, et cetera, and those who are what we call at JNS market communicators, but those who are communication specialists, often interfacing very deeply with clients, owning those client relationships along with their creative counterparts. And what I found is that people just have different lenses. And part of the success of working in a truly integrated way, which is a lot easier to say than to do, is to understand how you have to translate one perspective from the other. And I would always talk to people about when you are a creative professional, say a graphic designer, and there's an assignment in front of you, it's literally a blank page. And it's actually interesting to see how our teams are using AI now to kind of co-create and ideate together and bring something to that blank page and use technology merged with human creativity. But they're wrestling with a blank page, a blank slide, a blank canvas. Now, they don't know how long it's going to take, right, in those early moments, because they've got to create it. Meanwhile, you have very intense account people who are very type A, I was one of them, I get it, who want to know, when's it going to be done? This is my timeline. Here's the deadline. And so part of that translation is understanding that there is a magic to the creative process that requires some freedom and breadth and lack of knowing and exploration. And then you get to the point where you're like, okay, now I see where I'm going to make this deadline, right? And so that's what I feel is the translation. Part of our role as communicators and in an integrated setting is to help translate between those different disciplines and different views, but know that that process of creativity takes time and space.
On a personal level, how do you, as the CEO of GNS Integrated Marketing Communications Group, how do you find room for creativity in your day-to-day life?
It's a good question, and talking to Natalie really made me reflect on that. growing up, I was always a singer, and my husband is a professional musician. He's a drummer. So I have a very obvious form of creativity surrounding me at home. But in a more corporate setting, in the work I do, you could sometimes feel sort of penned in by the must do, like I must do this and I must do that, and I have a to do list, right? So for me, creativity comes in a couple different ways. One is constantly learning and absorbing information. I have just a voracious desire to accumulate knowledge and learn things, high culture, low culture, technical stuff, fluffy stuff, like whatever it is. And engaging that and connecting those dots and looking at something in one side and something that seems really alien and finding the relationship, the symbiotic nature of those topics and connecting the dots, which then bring to my work and my clients, that feels immensely creative. And then also, for me, the act of communication. And I do a lot of presentation skills training, speech coaching, media training. So for me, this act of communicating with another person and understanding how I create something between us, or I create an understanding in them that doesn't exist now, or I build something that has emotion to it and creates that connection, is immensely creative. And I really, really love that part of what I do.
So, last question on this note. You and Natalie also discussed that everyone is creative, but that this involves this interplay between play and process, or as Natalie phrases it, wonder and rigor. So, how can leaders practically create space for both wonder and rigor, play and process, in high pressure corporate environments?
Isn't that a great um, pair, wonder and rigor? I love the words. I love even saying them. But the reason I love this idea that Natalie's put out in the world and the way that she frames it is that wonder is on an equal footing as rigor. You know, they both have a space, right? Because I think that in corporate settings, again, whether it's one of our many, many client sectors or an organization like ours or any number of others out there, I've worked with hundreds and hundreds of organizations across my career and so many different people in different roles. But it tends to be a focus on the rigor, on the discipline, on the get it done, on the timeline, on the what are you trying to achieve. I do think in connecting with the fact that everyone is and can be creative and can unlock more of that themselves, um, you need to create space for curiosity. And I think that's embedded in what Natalie's talking about, the wonder of something, the exploration, curiosity, exploration, play, discovery, mistake making, dead ends. You try a dead end, but then suddenly maybe a door opens in it in a place you didn't expect. So, and that's an interesting question relative to AI, because this question now that causes a lot of angst, I think, especially for those who are focused in communications, is this issue of authorship. And, whether Claude or ChatGPT or pick any of the large language models, Gemini, as they're manifesting now, their ability to create content, and to create. And I think what's interesting about the written piece is that oftentimes it's that iteration and editing and discovery you go through that you actually don't know what you want to write when you start, and you find it by writing it. So this is what is particularly interesting to me about human creativity and machine creativity and how they're merging, because there's two different ways to it. One, I give you a prompt and we iterate. The other, especially on the human side, is like I find it by doing it and editing it and failing and creating it. So, and I don't think those are in opposition. I think we're going to see more and more. But that's why I love this idea of wonder and rigor.
Yeah, I love that. I love that idea of wonder and rigor, and feel like it's really applicable to people in various industries. So moving on to a new topic. So recently, you interviewed Howard Handler, who is the president of 313 Presents in Detroit, and he's also had key roles across plenty of different industries. He spoke about this idea of relationships being treasures, and he advised us that we should view and treat them as such. You also spoke advice from your father about not traveling, quote, too light in your life. So, what does this mean to you, and how should this apply to younger professionals in the field?
Oh, the Howard conversation was another I just love. Talk about treasures. That's a relationship that I've had for many years, came through a business setting, a client relationship, but somebody who really understands what it means to keep a network and to build people up and stay connected. And And also a really exciting role in Detroit now, having all these amazing venues and being part of that incredible energy that Detroit has right now. But Howard talked about relationships as treasures, which I really, that lit me up. Such a beautiful way to think about it. And it did remind me of something my father, Norman Green, had said about, Anne Elizabeth, don't travel too light in your life, meaning don't leave relationships behind, try to stay connected to people. And I was so worried growing up that I would. I just, for some reason, I felt like it was a prophecy or a warning that somehow I would. And what I've discovered over time, and it really relates to things one feels that they have to do as an adult, which is like network and stay connected. But to me, it was more about the joy of knowing that I have stayed connected to people in my life I care about, and that I'm also really excited to meet more people and create relationships with them. So I think that for younger professionals in the field, what's interesting is that we are in this hybrid landscape now, where pre-COVID, there were a lot of structures in place, like being in office more chance to travel, being in person more. Some of that has come back, right? But we all know that it's not what it was before. And so for younger professionals, they're going to have to be more, I think, intentional and thoughtful about maintaining relationships, building them, but also staying connected and saying, how is it that I prioritize this and make sure that I touch base with people and I figure out those. You can't stay in touch with everyone, by figuring out those relationships that matter. And especially in the business sense, how do they identify, wow, I've really enjoyed working with this person or that person. I want to make a decision to try to follow along with them and be in touch from time to time. It's going to have to be more intentional now. And I will say, as Howard said, it's something to be treasured. When you get to later stages in your career, it becomes quite special.
So, kind of on that note, so we live in a world of continuous networking. So, how do you find authenticity and how you maintain connections with those that you've met or worked with, while you're also like addressing the immediate needs that each day presents?
Yeah, authentic and authenticity is those very tricky concepts that can feel hollow sometimes if it's overused, but it's also very, very real, which is how do you bring yourself to these interactions? I think for me, and this is really how I see networking now, is just finding the joy in connecting with other people, really enjoying that, kind of letting it go. There are times when you're tired and you don't want to interact and you're just like, I'm not really fit for human consumption. And friends of mine know that I'll joke about, like, end of the week, I'm like, I'm not fit for for humans. But I think that taking it away from, I have to perform authenticity, I have to be a networker, I have to do something, I have to like create something or make a sale or make a connection or get whatever it is in the world that I live in. Can you get it back to the enjoyment of learning about other people, asking them questions, connecting with them, and also seeing if you can be of service to them? Is there something you can do to help? Or can you share a story or a smile or support them in some way that makes things better for them and that brings you enjoyment? That to me is the heart of it all.
Yeah, that makes sense. So we're going to shift gears into sort of more general questions that aren't necessarily tied to specific episodes. But
Okay,
once again,
sounds
definitely
good.
encourage people to go back and listen to all the episodes that we've talked about so far. So you've mentioned in a couple different episodes, I think, that you have sort of an unconventional path to communications and marketing. How did that experience prepare you for being the CEO of an agency?
Yeah, it's a good question. I was definitely the liberal arts young person and did not see myself as a business person in high school or college, but wanted work experience. And so that's when it was really an internship that brought me into integrated marketing communications at Burson Marsteller, which through many iterations is now known just as Burson, named after the legendary Harold Burson, who I would see in the elevator. It was really overwhelming, an amazing, lovely man. And I got to know him and a lot of other people who helped build that firm in the 70s and 80s into the powerhouse it was when I joined. So that's a legacy I'm proud of. But I think for me, right now, there's a lot of articles about and just insights and discussions about this world today, the level of volatility, of uncertainty, some people talk about permacrisis. It's a lot. And a lot of things that one might have counted on in a business context, it's just very different now. Um, and sometimes it's hard to gauge, is it completely different? Are there just aspects of it that are different? But it does feel different. And I think for me personally, I can't speak for others in my role, but for me personally, my path, which was very much about zooming out to the big picture and as I said, being very curious about many, 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 many things and being a learner and just being interested in collecting data and talking to people and layering learning and learning and learning. That's, you need that wide view right now. And I'm the CEO, but I have 7 partners and we have many other leaders here who are really engaged. But we have to zoom out and see the big picture of what's happening in the world, in society, in fields that may or may not directly impact our clients every day. And that helps me connect the dots. We have to be curious about technology. We have to throw ourselves into new things. We have to not get too caught up in the hype and yet not ignore the hype either. So this to me is a very much that kind of broad mindset that you get from an education that lets you be a little bit broader and connect the dots and get excited about learning on a macro level. So I think that would summarize, how I prepared myself for this role to the extent that I did.
That makes sense. And as a liberal arts kid myself, it very much resonates with me. So in a couple episodes from both this season and last season, you talked with guests like Howard Pyle, Kyle Turner, Kim Sample, and Mark McLennan about AI and the impact that it's going to have on brands in the near future across disciplines. And you've talked about both the ethical and practical perspectives and considerations in this area. So how are you using AI as an agency leader? And what are you impressed with or not impressed with when it comes to the tools that are currently available?
Yeah, absolutely. AI, everyone's favorite topic. I just spoke on this recently at an industry panel. And, for me, I really want to invite everybody to be thinking about it at a very ground level in terms of how is it changing day-to-day work? How is it being built into our tools, both personal and business? Then at that mid-level, which is like, what are those purposeful pilots? How do we start to be very intentional about how we're using it for us and our clients? And then at that 100,000-foot level, which is what does it mean to be human? What is augmented intelligence? What is authorship, IP? All that stuff. So for me, I'm thinking about it at all those levels. In terms of how I'm using AI, I'm looking deeply at a lot of different applications and testing them, from playing with different large language models to seeing how Microsoft has is baking and continuing to evolve Copilot within the Microsoft 365 environment, to how, Google Gemini is appearing in search, and just how I'm using search. How much am I using those AI results that Gemini is aggregating at the top of a search page versus how much am I drilling down into traditional search results, and how does it feel, and what is the sourcing? And the other thing I'm trying to do is look at the tools and really ask myself, what are the killer apps for me? And what I mean by that is killer app was a nomenclature kind of the rise of the iPhone and the mobile world. And it's those apps. Oh, it's a killer app, right? The app that, runs away with popularity. But my first killer app was in the 80s with IBM clone, DOS-based computers, which I was very skeptical about until I realized there was something called spell check. And when I saw that there was spell check, I was like, I need a computer now. And it's the same thing with Google Maps. When they added live traffic data to the map, that spurred a lot of people to get a phone finally. So these are the kinds of moments where your personal life or your business life and the application and the utility of it really light up. So what I'm trying to do is find those killer apps for me that help me work smarter, not harder. And also things that are going to help me ideate, because we have to, per our discussion about creativity, you need the wonder and the rigor. So I think that AI, especially if we're treating it like an agent, not a tool, and we're iterating back and forth with the large language models, asking questions, exploring, that's the kind of way in which we can, figure out how to unlock our own creativity through augmented intelligence. So those are some of the ways, understanding it, looking deeply at those killer apps, and understanding what applications our people are using and that they should be using.
Makes sense. So we have 2 more questions. So when you talk about the importance of human connections with brands, especially in the world of B2B, what is it that good brands do to connect better on a human level?
Yeah, and it's interesting. Obviously, there's always a sense that business to consumer brands have an edge in connecting versus business to business brands. We do a lot of work. We do B2C work too, but we do a lot of work in the B2B space. I think that it goes back to something I mentioned earlier in the episode regarding really knowing your audiences, really knowing them, not assuming things, but using research and talking and being on the ground and getting more connected and trying not to shortcut that knowledge because it's the knowledge of who those stakeholders are, not a monolith, not just a fancy name that somebody in marketing gave them like for their demographic, but to try to dig deeper and say what are the threads and the interests and the desires and the concerns that really fuel these individuals as people as well as buyers of services or clients, customers. And I think that that is what is the foundation for good brand connection, because that helps then inform strategies and channels that are going to be meaningful and not just more noise. Because I tell you, the other thing about AI is it is pumping a lot of noise into the ecosystem. There's been a lot of coverage about, we can market at scale now, and you can have a whole bunch of what some people are calling AI slop created to push out via email, push out on the web, etc. So it's only going to get noisier. That means a deeper knowledge and more care about the channels and the tactics used is going to be more critical than ever to connect on, as you asked, that human level.
Makes sense. And last question is, in a general sense, what should brands focus on in their communications through the year's end? And what do you think is most important for any brand to share widely?
Yeah, it's I think the first thing that comes to mind to me is just the ongoing volatility and intensity of the landscape. And that's true if it's B2B, B2C, it's distracting, it's overwhelming. The news cycle is very intense. There's things happening domestically, globally. There's weather events. It's just a lot. We recently had an election, et cetera. It's just a lot of noise. And then there's a lot of pressure about what is valuable, and AI or technology or, and what people should be paying attention to. So I do think there's a lot of folks that are tired and overwhelmed and information overload. So I think recognizing that the landscape's going to remain volatile and it's going to be a difficult up and down kind of news cycle for a long time to come is important. I think it's really important, first and foremost, end of year, but throughout, is to stay very close, first and foremost, to your own people as an organization, really take the temperature and understand where they're at, and how they're feeling is going to be a proxy for how the customer is feeling often. How are they able to describe? Do they feel the value in what they're doing? Do they understand the value of what they're selling or offering, the services? And how are they translating that through? And I think, trying to be as transparent as you can be to the extent you can be, and really keeping your eye and your team's eye, not just in the trench of today. It's like you're down in the trenches of today, but how do you lift your eyes up and out toward that next horizon? That's a little bit of a magic trick, but I think that's what we're going to have to keep doing as leaders in whatever industry we're in. Stay close to your people, understand the landscape is volatile and noisy, try to be transparent, and keep your eyes not just down at today, but also up at tomorrow.
I love all that. I love all that. So that brings us to the end of our slated questions.
Well, this was a lot of fun. I'm glad we could do it. We always want people to share questions and comments. And as you said earlier, John, there's a lot of great episodes here. I love revisiting them. Check them out. If there's more information that people want, reach out, let us know. But a great place to start is by going back and revisiting some of those episodes.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, and I thought, I think you tapped into a lot of the really great insights and topics that were covered in those episodes, but also we forged into some new territory that is more timely than ever. So awesome job on that front.
Great. Well, thank you, John. I appreciate it.
Thank you.